Welcome to the Read Aloud for April 28th. We're starting a new book today, so I decided to use a new guitar. Well, it's not really new, but you know. So let's see. Calm Down song. We'll figure it out. Okay, so I had to stop myself from reading The Hobbit because I really just wanted to read The Hobbit, you know. I even had it down and I even started reading the first page, and then I was like in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit, and I was like, oh, I'll save it. I'm gonna save it till next year. We're gonna read it next year. Okay, so I asked my wife and my family, and they said that we should read The Witches. It's pretty short, should go pretty quick, so maybe we'll finish it by the end of the year. Okay, a note about witches. In fairy tales, witches always wear silly black hats and black cloaks, and they ride on broomsticks. But this is not a fairy tale. This is about real witches. The most important thing you should know about real witches is this. Listen carefully. Never forget what is coming next. Real witches dress in ordinary clothes and look very much like ordinary women. They live in ordinary houses and they work in ordinary jobs. That is why they are so hard to catch. A real witch hates children with a red-hot, sizzling hatred that is more sizzling and red-hot than any hatred you could possibly imagine. A real witch spends all her time plotting to get rid of children in her particular territory. Her passion is to do away with them one by one. It is all she thinks about the whole day long, even if she is working as a cashier in a supermarket or typing letters for a businessman or driving around in a fancy car, and she could be doing any of these things. Her mind will always be plotting and scheming and churning and burning and whizzing and fizzing with murderous, bloodthirsty thoughts. Which child, she says to herself all day long, exactly which child shall I choose next for my squelching? A real witch gets the same pleasure from squelching a child as you get from eating a plateful of strawberries and thick cream. She reckons on doing away with one child a week. Anything less than that and she becomes grumpy. One child a week is 52 a year. Squish them and squiggle them and make them disappear. That is their motto. That is the motto of all witches. Very carefully a victim is chosen. Then the witch stalks the wretched child like a hunter stalking a little bird in the forest. She treads softly. She moves quietly. She gets closer and closer. And then at last, when everything is ready, whoosh, and she swoops, sparks fly, flames leap, oil boils, rats howl, skin shrivels, and the child disappears. A witch, you must understand, does not knock children on the head or stick knives in them or shoot them with a pistol. People who do those things get caught by the police. A witch never gets caught. Don't forget that she has magic in her fingers and devilry dancing in her blood. She can make stones jump about like frogs, and you can make tongues of flame go flickering across the surface of the water. These magic powers are very frightening. Luckily, there are not a great number of real witches in the world, but there are still quite enough to make you nervous. In England, there are probably about 100 of them altogether. Some countries have more, others have not quite so many. No country in the world is completely free from witches. A witch is always a woman. I do not wish to speak badly about women. Most women are lovely, but the fact remains that all witches are women. There is no such thing as a male witch. On the other hand, a ghoul is always male. So indeed is a Barghest. Both are dangerous, but neither of them is half as dangerous as a real witch. As far as children are concerned, a real witch is easily the most dangerous of all the living creatures on earth. What makes her doubly dangerous is the fact that she doesn't look dangerous. Even when you know all the secrets, you will hear about those in a minute, you can still never be quite sure whether it is a witch you are gazing at or just a kind lady. If a tiger were able to wag or were able to make himself look like a large dog with a waggy tail, you would probably go up and pat him on the head, and that would be the end of you. It is the same with witches. They all look nice, look like nice ladies. Kindly examine the picture opposite. Which lady is a witch? That is a difficult question, but it is one that every child must try to answer. For all you know, a witch might be living next door to you right now. Or she might be the woman with the bright eyes who sat opposite you on the bus this morning. She might be the lady with dazzling smile who offered you a sweet from a white paper bag in the street before lunch. She might even, and this will make you jump, she might even be your lovely school teacher who is reading these words to you at this very moment. Look carefully at that teacher. Perhaps she is smiling at the absurdity of such a suggestion. Don't let that put you off. It could be part of her cleverness. I am not, of course, telling you for 1 second that your teacher is actually a witch. All I am saying is that she might be one. It is most unlikely, but, and here comes the big but, it is not impossible. Oh, if only there were a way of telling for sure whether a woman was a witch or not. Then we could round them all up and put them in a meat grinder. Unhappily, there is no such way. But there are a number of little signals you can look out for, little quirky habits that all witches have in common. And if you know about these, if you remember them always, you might just possibly manage to escape from being squelched before you are very much older. Okay, this is chapter titled My Grandmother. I myself had 2 separate encounters with witches before I was 8 years old. From the first, I escaped unharmed, but on the second occasion, I was not so lucky. Things happened to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them. That can't be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I am still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. My grandmother was Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches, for Norway, with its black forests and icy mountains, is where the first witches came from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I had been born there and had lived there and had started going to an English school. Twice a year at Christmas and in the summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. This old lady, as far as I could gather, was just about the only surviving relative we had on either side of our family. She was my mother's mother, and I absolutely adored her. When she and I were together, we spoke either Norwegian or in English. It didn't matter which. We were equally fluent in both languages, and I have to admit that I felt closer to her than my mother. Soon after my 7th birthday, my parents took me as usual to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway, and it was over there while my father and mother and I were driving in icy weather just north of Oslo that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling down into a rocky ravine. My parents were killed. I was firmly strapped into the back seat and received only a cut on the forehead. I won't go into the horrors of that terrible afternoon. I still get the shivers when I think about it. I finished up, of course, back at my grandmother's house with her arms around me tight and both of us crying the whole night long. What are you going to do now? I asked her through the tears. You will stay here with me, she said, and I will look after you. Aren't I going back to England? Nope, she said. I could never do that. Heaven shall take my soul, but Norway shall keep my bones. And the very next day, in order that we might both try to forget our great sadness, my grandmother started telling me stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me, but I didn't become really excited until she got onto the subject of witches. She was apparently a great expert on these creatures, and she made it very clear to me that her witch stories, unlike most of the others, were not imaginary tales. They were all true. They were the gospel truth. They were the history. Everything she was telling me about witches had actually happened, and I had better believe it. What was worse, what was far, far worse, was that witches were still with us. They were all around us, and I had better believe that too. Are you really being truthful, Grandmama? Really and truly truthful? My darling, she said, you won't last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one. But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandmama. So how can I spot them? You must listen to me, my grandmother said. You must remember everything I tell you. After that, all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best. We were in the big living room of our house in Oslo, and I was ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the windows I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly to an outside world that was as black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled with a massive white body which was smothered in gray lace. She sat there majestic in her armchair, filling every inch of it. Not even a mouse could have squeezed in to sit beside her. I myself, just 7 years old, was crouched on the floor at her feet, wearing pajamas, dressing gown, and slippers. "You swear you aren't pulling my leg?" I kept saying to her. "You swear you aren't just pretending?" "Listen," she said. "I have known no less than 5 children who have simply vanished off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. The witches took them." "I still think you're just trying to frighten me," I said. "I'm trying to make sure you don't go the same way," she said. "I love you and I want you to stay with me." "Tell me about the children who disappeared," I said. My grandmother was the only grandmother I ever met who smoked cigars. She lit one now, a long black cigar that smelt of burning rubber. "The first child I knew who disappeared," she said, "was called Rangadol Hansen. Rangahil was about 8 at the time, and she was playing with her little sister on the lawn. Their mother, who was baking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath of air. 'Where's Rangadol?' she asked." Here's the picture. "She went away with the tall lady," the little sister said. "What tall lady?" the mother said. "The tall lady in the white gloves," the little sister said. "She took Ragdoll by the hand and led her away." "No one," my grandmother said, "ever saw Ragdoll again." "Didn't they search for her?" I asked. "Oh, they searched for miles around. Everyone in the town helped, but they never found her." "What happened to the other 4 children?" I asked. "They vanished just as Ragdoll did." "How, Grandmama? How did they vanish?" "In every case, a strange lady was seen outside the house just before it happened." "But how did they vanish?" I asked. "The second one was peculiar," my grandmother said. "There was a family called Christensen. They lived up in Holholken, and they had an old oil painting in their living room which they were very proud of. The painting showed some ducks in the yard outside a farmhouse. There were no people in the painting, just a flock of ducks on grassy farmland and the farmhouse in the back. In the background. It was a large painting and rather pretty. Well, one day their daughter Slavik came home from school eating an apple. She said a nice lady had given it to her on the street, and the next morning little Slavik was not in her bed. The parents searched everywhere, but they couldn't find her. Then all of a sudden her father shouted, "There she is! That's Slavik feeding the ducks!" He was pointing at the oil painting, and sure enough, Slavik was in it. She was standing in the farmyard in the act of throwing bread to the ducks out of a basket. The father rushed up to the painting and touched her, but that didn't help. She was simply a part of the painting, just a picture painted on the canvas. "Did you ever see the painting, Grandmama, with the little girl in it?" "Many times," my grandmother said, and the peculiar thing was that little Slavik kept changing her position in the picture. One day she would actually be inside the farmhouse and you could see her face looking out of the window. Another day she would be far over to the left with a duck in her arms. "Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandmama?" Nobody did. Wherever she was, whether outside feeding the ducks or inside looking out the window, she was always motionless, just a figure painted in oils. It was all very odd, my grandmother said, very odd indeed. And what was most odd of all was that as the years went by, she kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years, the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years, she was middle-aged. Then all at once, 54 years after it all happened, she disappeared from the picture altogether. "You mean she died?" I said. "Who knows," Grandmother said. "Some very mysterious things go on in the world of witches." "That's 2 you've told me about," I said. "What happened to the 3rd one?" "The 3rd one was little Birgit Stevenson," my grandmother said. "She lived just across the road from us. One day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month, she had turned into a large white chicken, and her parents kept her for years in a pen in the garden. She even laid eggs." And we're going to stop there for today. I really like how he writes. It's pretty fun. We'll finish this book quick. Okay, see you guys.